NATO, or the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, was founded in the aftermath of the Second World War to maintain peace and freedom and prevent conflict. In 1949, facing a growing threat from the Soviet Union, 12 countries from Europe and North America signed a treaty committing to the principle of collective defense. An attack against one of these countries would be considered an attack against all of them. Since then, NATO has helped to preserve peace for its members by providing a unique forum for dialogue, peaceful resolution of disputes, and cooperation on a wide range of political and security-related issues, and also by deterring aggression from potential adversaries. Today, NATO's
preparing to transport 800,000 soldiers and 200,000 armored vehicles to the border with Russia in the event of full-scale war. The publication Der Spiegel just reported this after gaining access to secret military documents. But moving that many troops would be a massive undertaking, unlike anything we've seen in recent history. How does NATO plan to achieve that goal? What challenges are there to deploying that many soldiers across the world? And what are some of the strengths and weaknesses of a collective defense alliance? If you want peace, prepare for war. Key to understanding NATO's plan are 5 new transportation routes, each one centered around a different port where transportation ships will be filled with troops and vehicles.
And over the past year or two, there have been profound changes in NATO. We have new war plans for the first time in 35 years. We have new force and readiness models. They make 700% more European troops available to me as the Supreme Allied Commander than just a couple of years ago.
But before you start digging a fallout shelter in your backyard, keep in mind that every major power, including Russia, North Korea, Iran, and China, have contingency plans just like this one. Actually, I'm not sure if that makes me feel better or worse. The stated reason for the creation of these new movement corridors is because Russia's long-range missiles could destroy ports, bridges, or bases. Looking at this map, we can see all of Europe is within range of many different types of Russian ballistic missiles. This would severely limit transportation options and could make mobilizing troops under the current plan unsustainable. Redundancy is very important. That's why my squad leader nicknamed me Redundant. The northernmost new avenue would start by landing American troops in Norway for a cold opening to the war. For the first time in 2024, the US Army dropped off 200 armored vehicles and 300 supply containers here at the port of Narvik. 1,600 US Army soldiers from the 10th Mountain Division traveled over 880 kilometers by rail and roadway to prove that this option was even viable. The route pushes through Sweden and Finland. Norway is what's known as a transit country for NATO strategy. It's like in Civilization 5 where you tell your nation that your troops are just passing through and then they have to approve it. This option was never on the table before because those countries just joined NATO in 2024, so a new route has now been unlocked. But there are limitations in this direction. A 13-hour convoy drive to the border with Russia is a long way to go. This long distance, as well as the limited amount of available port space, might limit the amount of heavy armor deployed through here. The officer who doesn't know his communications and supply, as well as his tactics, is totally useless. Take a look at this port of Bremerhaven in Germany. US General Ben Hodges said Bremerhaven and Hamburg are actually the most important seaports on which the alliance depends for military equipment. It's a massive 80,000 square meter center that can offload 370 pieces of armored vehicles from a transport ship in 14 hours, so it can handle an entire armored brigade in a day. Then there are railroads located right on the port that send equipment straight to the eastern border of Poland. This is key because otherwise that's a 1,200 kilometer drive. If you tried to convoy tanks that way, you'd have to replace tracks, eat up enormous amounts of fuel, and run down your equipment. You'd be cooked before you even got to the fight. The secret documents obtained by Der Spiegel reveal that the A2 highway would play a major role in the mobilization. The A2 highway is the Autobahn to Armageddon. If this ever actually happened, it would be the real highway to hell. It runs in 2 lanes in each direction, with a shoulder, for over 1,000 kilometers through Germany, Poland, from east to west. It's the fastest, shortest east to west route. But one of the vulnerabilities of the A2 highway is that it has several bridges that would be key targets for Russian missile attacks or sabotage. Moscow has already been linked to arson attacks throughout Europe. That's why NATO would deploy additional temporary bridges. Poland has been upgrading the strength of their bridges quietly along this A2 route, partly so that they can carry the increased weight of the M1 Abrams tanks that can weigh around 70 tons. What makes this whole story worthy of looking at is because both sides are no longer just putting pen to paper on these contingency plans. They're putting actual brick to mortar and physically building out the infrastructure to support a full-scale war. To give you an idea of just how many assets need to be moved, the NATO security alliance is made up of 32 different countries and a military strength of 3.3 million active duty soldiers. Between them, they operate 22,300 aircraft, 2,250 naval ships, and over 870,000 ground combat vehicles, including 11,300 main battle tanks. But all of those assets are only useful if you can effectively transport them to various locations that they would be needed on the eastern flank. Welcome to my barely credible defense briefing on America's part of the plan. Please take a seat. Thank you very much. First slide. Deploying large conventional forces is reliant on America's strategic rail corridor network, as seen here in the red lines. It consists of 35,000 miles of freight track that are a priority for national defense. They connect to 193 military bases across the country with seaports on the east and west coast. Privately owned train companies like Union Pacific give the Department of Defense priority access in emergency situations. For deployment to the European theater, there are two main seaports that are used for embarkation, one at Beaumont, Texas, and the other at Charleston, South Carolina. This whole process would take about 3 weeks for a heavy armored brigade combat team from A to Z. Once at the port, the Navy's Sea Lift takes over. A privately owned company called American Roll-On Roll-Off is one of the only ones who uses a special kind of massive carrier to transport across the Atlantic. The ro-ro ship called Endurance can carry 1,333 different pieces of heavy armored equipment, which is basically an entire armored brigade combat team in one single lift. From what I can tell, they have 5 of those massive civilian ships dedicated to the European theater, which means the US can surge about roughly 5 brigades of about 6,500 armored pieces for 20,000 soldiers within 3 to 6 months. Listen to US General Ovos, commander of the Transportation Command, explain how important this is.
We cannot do our job every day without our strong commercial partnerships. In fact, 90% of our passengers flow through commercial operations, and day to day, 97% of our sustainment goes through commercial sea lift, and it provides us an asymmetric advantage.
American Roll-On Roll-Off Company is actually owned by a Norwegian company. Warfare today requires more than investment in defense budget. It requires the cooperation in a defense alliance of each nation's civilian assets like ships and rail networks worth billions of dollars. Defense alliances are like my old squad leader used to say, I know my calculus, it says you plus me equals us.
The top vulnerability concern I have with them is through cyber, frankly. We have heard, even from the CIA director, the PRC has infiltrated some of the logistics networks.
There are new threats to these supply lines, especially with cyber warfare, which could cripple these ports. But the journey has only started. Getting to European shores is where the threat starts to get even more threatier. Clearly, logistics is the hard part of fighting a war. To speed up the process, NATO planners have struck new agreements between countries. This has eliminated the majority of the red tape that comes with transporting armored vehicles across nations. What required mountains of paperwork and international certifications in the past, today basically requires a handshake and some pouches of Zyn. During these 3 to 6 months of time that you need to build up, you need places to house, resupply, and feed thousands of soldiers who are convoying through Germany. Hostiles aren't going to cut it. So the plan calls for every 500 meters, there would need to be a rest stop for troops, kind of like a Buc-ee's except run by like Halliburton. Because God help me, you don't want your military personnel using the same rest stops as civilians. The lines to get gasoline and a bratwurst schnitzel would be 3 hours long. The report also indicates German police would need new powers to guard the influx of potential Russian prisoners of war. So they're thinking of every possible scenario ahead of time. The West can't just dust off old battle plans from the 1980s and slap a new label on it. While the geography of the Fulda Gap and the Hof Corridor haven't changed, how they would be used and defended has changed dramatically. Keep in mind, the last major mobilization plan for NATO was from the 1980s. It was built to fight the Soviet Union on the border of West Germany. The potential front has moved 800 kilometers to the east since then. A lot of people might not know this, but before the collapse of the Soviet Union, construction of highways in Poland was very limited and slow. This animation shows us the Finnish-Polish highways in green starting from 1970. So you can see that it wasn't until 2013 that the A2 motorway, the east to west route, was largely finished, making this kind of journey more possible. How are you supposed to fight a war if there isn't even a road that gets there? If we were really interested in peace, we'd stop inventing roads. The line between disorder and order lies in logistics. I think it's important that we talk for a second about these secret military documents obtained by Der Spiegel. I think it's likely that these were purposefully leaked by NATO officials as a way of signaling to Russia that they're taking the possibility of war seriously. Russia probably leaked nuclear war plans in February of 2024 for this exact same reason. I say this because unnamed Western officials had already spoken to the Telegraph about this same NATO deployment plan back in June 2024. Then on July 17th, about a week after the reports first dropped, Newsweek finally got verbal confirmation from a spokesperson at the German Defense Ministry that yes, they are working on a contingency plan like this. German defense officials confirmed that it's part of Op Plan DEU, or Operational Plan Germany. To this point, a NATO command spokesperson said to Newsweek about the new plan, the ability to quickly relocate large NATO troop contingents to the alliance's eastern flank in the event of a deterioration in the security situation is the central pillar of conventional deterrence. Your adversary isn't deterred if they don't believe you could actually support a war against them. Honestly, I'd be kind of worried about what all the Russian, Chinese, and American military officers were doing in their idle time if they weren't coming up with contingency plans like this. My point is, if any of these details were really meant to be kept secret, they wouldn't be openly confirmed and leaked for months. It's important that we keep in mind when watching war hype videos or reading articles about this topic that NATO's official stance is that they want to avoid war with Russia.
My job is to deter, both in my NATO role and in my U.S. role. My primary job is to deter aggression and to avert a war, not to fight one.
Even U.S. intelligence reports believe that Russia's not seeking direct military action with NATO as of now. I don't view contingency plans from Russia or the United States as suggesting that this will happen tomorrow or that either side wants war, although that is certainly possible. Personally, I view them as an attempt to show your adversary that you're prepared for war in order to prevent it. However, it's crucial to consider counterpoints to NATO's strategy. Critics argue that large-scale military preparations like this one could escalate tensions unnecessarily and provoke a security dilemma. Russian officials have condemned NATO's buildup as an aggressive and violation of previous agreements aimed at reducing military presence near their borders. NATO's outlined that they view Russia's actions in Ukraine as the root cause of escalation in the region. One of the clearest signs of this plan in action, I think, comes from looking at the changes to the freight network in the region. The freight train network from the Netherlands through Germany to Poland is a very important route. It starts at the port of Lissingen. This is where American shipments of weapons and armored vehicles have already been staged and then transferred throughout Europe, including equipment that's sent to Ukraine. But I've observed a new development along this line. This official U.S. government website publicly announced a $225 million investment in a new section of railway here. The U.S. government's looking for construction firms to partner with and rebuild a railway that extends from Poland to a military airfield near Lviv in Ukraine. The official reason for this is to help Ukraine's economy export agricultural products. Unofficially, though, open source analysts believe that it's a way to rapidly expand transfer of weapons into Ukraine. This was first brought to my attention by our open source intelligence sleuths on our Discord server, so much appreciation to the Spare Parts Army hard at work there. The US Agency for International Development is now redeveloping a 75-kilometer section between Lviv and Mostovka and its freight station there. This will connect Ukraine to Europe with a new standard rail for the first time. According to the project, the entire section will be equipped with the European standard rail gauge. What that means is that it will connect Ukraine directly to Poland by rail and the rest of Europe via one continuous standard rail track for the first time ever. This line connects with Rzeszów in Poland, which is about 100 kilometers away. We already know that this city is where the majority of NATO military weapons aid is sent by rail before it's trucked into Ukraine. Soon, they'll be able to travel straight by rail, greatly expediting the process. My logisticians are a humorless lot. They know if my campaign fails, they're the first ones I will slay. Throughout these routes are pre-positioned warehouse stocks called APS-2. This includes armored vehicles and weapons located in Belgium, Netherlands, Germany, and Poland. APS-2 cuts down drastically on the amount of time required to deploy equipment by ships. To that point, NATO currently has 11,600 forward deployed soldiers in Poland, led by US forces, in addition to Poland's own forces. Of course, you can't just draw big arrows on a map and call it a day. Any joint movement corridor has to be carefully considered both from a military standpoint and a civic one. Shuffling foreign troops back and forth across multiple countries isn't as simple as a drive from point A to point B. There are numerous factors that hinder a country's military from getting to the front lines, including things like weight limitations on bridges. Another planned avenue would run from ports in Italy to Slovenia, Croatia, and Hungary. There are plans to fly into Turkey and then move from there as well. I remember when my battalion was mobilized to Latvia, our Strykers, armored vehicles, were offloaded from ships at ports. Movement by sea like this is way less maintenance intensive than flying armor in by air.
We are exercising sea lift capacity, which is shallow draft sea lift, running essentially a network below the network of airplanes, because it will fully consume our airlift fleet if we fly everything.
Which is much less efficient. So why are there so many different avenues of approach? In the past, everyone was consolidated at as few major bases as possible, these giant FOBs or forward operating bases, but this new way of spreading out is because of a new emerging military doctrine that calls for widely dispersed operations. The new plan calls for decentralized operations by small units located far away from large permanent bases that are vulnerable to missile strikes. We've already seen how efficient widely dispersed tactics can be. Just look at how the Houthis have continued their missile strikes in the Red Sea by spreading out and largely avoiding punishing American airstrikes. So NATO's spending $2.7 billion on expanding the Romanian 57th Air Base to become its most important base near Ukraine. It'll become the largest NATO base in Europe, with a perimeter more than 30 square kilometers. The base will have additional runways for more fighter jets and C-17 strategic airlift to fly troops and equipment into. The 57th Air Base in Romania is expanding to house 10,000 NATO personnel. Amateurs talk about tactics, but professionals study logistics. NATO is not only changing how they physically move troops to the front, they're also adjusting how they invest in collective defense. There are some strengths and weaknesses to this approach. Each country is being asked to focus on one area of defense. The military has a phrase that captures this theory, I think. It's fight smart, not hard. My old squad leader used to say that to me all the time. In theory, the way it works is that the United Kingdom, France, they focus their investment on the Navy, Air Force, and nuclear weapons. Meanwhile, Poland focuses on investing in the army, stockpiling of main battle tanks, and Germany's main role is as an industrial base, where they manufacture artillery and tank munitions. Combined, NATO has ramped up artillery shell production to 2 million shells per year today, and they're on track to reach 3 million shells by 2025. The smaller Baltic states are focused on cybersecurity contributions. Underpinning all of this is the United States with its roughly 4,000 main battle tanks, including those in storage, and 45,000 armored vehicles stockpiled in reserve. That's a 10,000-mile-high oversimplification of NATO's evolving collective defense strategy. After the collapse of the Soviet Union and during the War on Terror, NATO countries moved away from a collective defense, and they focused more on creating like a self-sustained military that didn't rely on an alliance to operate. Collective defense wasn't really strongly revisited as a concept until 2012 at the NATO Chicago summit, when former Prime Minister of the Czech Republic said that a greater emphasis must be put on the sharing of resources, country-to-country cooperation, and the creation of joint projects based on specific priorities. 2 years later, after Russia's invasion of Crimea in 2014, NATO launched their Framework Nations concept at the Wales Summit. This is when the alliance started to ask countries to focus on one area, because the purpose of mutual defense is to achieve maximum efficiency of armed forces, with the minimum necessary expenditures. Looking at any one single NATO member and its capabilities to go to war kind of misses the whole point of being part of a collective defense. Canada and the UK would not be fighting a major war today without the support of the rest of the alliance. However, critics highlight several vulnerabilities in NATO's approach. Collective defense relies heavily on mutual trust and resource sharing among member nations. If this trust were to falter, the strategy could be compromised. One of the best ways to see this framework nations concept in action is to look at the NATO response force that was established in 2006. It's gone from 13,000 personnel to 40,000 personnel, and now it's just announced that it will be grown to 300,000 strong force. In 2024, it was rebranded as the Allied Reaction Force to illustrate its change in mindset to collective defense. NATO Secretary General Stoltenberg explained this plan as part of their updated strategy. So it's a 3-tier force model. Tier 1 has 100,000 troops ready to deploy within 10 days. Tier 2 would have 200,000 troops ready within 30 days. And Tier 3 would have 500,000 troops ready for combat within 180 days. When we look at the overarching structure of NATO, it's not just a collection of separate independent armies that all decided to fight on the same side. Today, each country tries to specialize in one or two areas. This way, the sum of the parts is supposed to be greater than the whole. For example, if you ran a business where you produce cars, you wouldn't want all of your workers just making steering wheels, even though those are an important part of the car. In collective defense, the same is true. You don't want every country focusing on building tanks. But there's a major vulnerability to collective defense. If every nation is specialized, this accepts more risk if the entire alliance doesn't stick together. One of the major points of contention in the alliance is the defense burden. How much should each member state contribute, and what happens if they don't reach the minimum amount?
In 2024, at least 20 nations are expected to meet the 2% of GDP defense spending, compared to only 3 who met it in 2014.
In 2024, that was the first year that the NATO's combined allies in Europe reached their goal of 2% of combined GDP on defense spending. 23 out of 32 members now meet that current goal, but nations have to trust their allies to come to their defense in the event of war. In the unlikely scenario that the United States or a major other country were to pull out of the NATO alliance, then specializing your forces just became a major liability instead of a strength. It's like one of those corporate trust fall exercises, but the stakes are a little higher. Alliances have an inherent vulnerability in that if each member isn't on the same page, it weakens their response. But there are no defense strategies that are without any risk and limitation. And this brings up another unique challenge to collective defense. There are some shared assets that are in demand, like air defense and strategic airlift capabilities. They're in short supply, including assets like early warning radar aircraft. NATO command needs to determine who gets priority and who does not. A reality of collective defense is that sometimes other nations' security might be judged as a priority over your own. Reports are now coming out that NATO has enough air defense equipment to protect 5% of its airspace on its eastern flank. How accurate that number is and exactly how it's calculated is up for debate, and doesn't include the role that other aircraft play in controlling airspace, but it reveals how airspace control is a major issue facing NATO, and collective defense can strain the limits of human trust because you might be sending your country's air defense to protect a more important region that's not your own. In an attempt to mitigate these risks, according to NATO leadership, they focused on preventing war in first place. The main move made here is that since 2015, NATO has forward deployed 4 international battle groups made up of a collection of different countries working in cooperation.
The first thing we've done is we've responded to the Russian aggression by bolstering our presence along with NATO's presence on the eastern flank. We did that over the last 2 years.
Since then, that number has increased to 8. They're spread out across Bulgaria, Estonia, Hungary, Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, and Slovakia. The theory, according to NATO, is that the presence of these troops will prevent a full-scale war. NATO's evolving logistics plan shows us the monumental, collaborative effort required to bolster collective defense. Challenges remain in balancing trust and resource allocation. But as NATO builds these new pathways, my hope is that they will lead to peace instead of war.